Hello everybody and welcome to Rest and Reason. I'm RP the Red Panda and today we're going to be doing the final preliminary round of our Season 1 Area Control board games. And we've already done Modern versus Classic board games. We've already done 4X versus Diplomacy board games, and now we're going to be looking at original games versus derivative games. Now, round 1 for the original games is Clash of the Galliforms versus Small World. Now, Clash of the Galliforms sits as a cautionary tale to designers. It's a really great concept, but they didn't do the math before they put the game out there. And that means that I, as a reviewer, have to tell them to either edit it or to send it to people at a not very good level. Ultimately, make sure you've done the math before you send the game out. It gets thrown off the shelf. It's not a recliner at all. But Small World is given a gold recliner, goes right up to that second shelf. It is an excellent game. It is a well-reaching game. It's a game that you'll be able to play a lot of times. Our next matchup is Oath versus Root. Now, these are both published by the same publisher with the same artist, I believe, or at least the same art style, and they're both very similar games. They both have a lot of player interaction. There's some level of almost negotiation / almost team play sometimes. But they're both actually very different from each other as well. Root has asymmetric factions right at the beginning of the game and has the same experience every single game. Oath has asymmetric factions that actually only have the asymmetry of different goals, and they only get different in their abilities and what they can do throughout the game instead of right at the beginning. Also, Oath is a game that spills over into future games. It's not just a one-game experience, it's a multi-game experience. And I wouldn't call it quite a legacy game, because it is and it isn't a legacy game. It's not like other legacy games. It's a very unique and wonderful experience. Now, ultimately, Root fell into the trap that I find most asymmetric games fall into, and that is that the factions aren't balanced. Now, many people will argue, well, they are balanced if you play it right. That's not inherently balanced factions. That means that the designers didn't balance them well. It should be that people don't have to fight people unless they're doing really well at the game. Otherwise, if they're having to fight people because that faction's really strong, that's a mistake in the design of the game. Root has to get a bronze recliner because of that. And ultimately, it's a game I would only recommend to people who will be able to play it over and over and over again with the same group, so that group can learn how to make certain factions less good and balance it out for themselves. Whereas Oath gets a silver recliner. Even though it's a little bit difficult in its rules, Oath's design is better and it goes up to this second shelf. Now, over on the derivative side of things, you have Star Wars Rebellion versus War of the Ring. Star Wars Rebellion is a really excellent game for an IP. You really get immersed in the world of Star Wars. You feel like you're controlling the Rebel Alliance or the Empire, and it's a great dueling game. War of the Ring is a really good immersive experience, but is not a really good game. Notice I said experience, not game. It's ultimately coming down to the fact that War of the Ring has a lot of really clunky mechanics. Mechanics people think are cool, but actually are extremely poorly designed. For example, in War of the Ring, you have random dice determining what you can and can't do on a round. But that would mean that if somebody gets unlucky enough to roll no recruitment when they have no armies on the board, well, then they just got screwed and the game's pretty much over for them. Whereas Star Wars Rebellion has pretty crisp mechanics. So War of the Ring gets a bronze recliner. I would only recommend it for people who want to experience the War of the Ring specifically. Whereas Star Wars Rebellion gets a silver recliner, I would say it's pretty great and it goes right up to this second shelf. Next up, we have a super match between Cyclades, Kemet, Blood Rage, Innis, and Rising Sun. These 5 board games are all monster area control games, except technically Innis kind of isn't, kind of is. People group these with Innis, even though Innis doesn't have any monsters. It's because they have kind of similar mechanics despite not having any monsters. Ultimately speaking, though, The only one of these 5 I would say you shouldn't probably buy is Blood Rage. Blood Rage not only doesn't do a good job with Norse mythology, it doesn't make Odin the most powerful god, it doesn't make Thor the most powerful god, it makes Loki the most powerful god, which is not even close to accurate. On top of that, it also has clunky mechanics because things just don't quite fit together the way that they should for synergy. So it gets a bronze recliner. The rest of these get silver recliners, and they all have strengths and weaknesses. Cyclades is an excellent Greek mythology game. You're gonna feel like you're really immersed in the Greek world. Part of its reason for being the lowest in this group, aside from Blood Rage, is because it's such an old game that a lot of its mechanics are a little clunky, a little off, and not quite the way they could have been or should have been. Ultimately, just barely ahead of it is Innis. Now, Innis has a lot of really interesting, cool ideas, designs, but ultimately its theme is painted on. It also is a little bit harder to introduce to new players because all of the cards have individual actions and there are basically no actions outside of the cards. So if somebody needs to ask you a question, they're going to reveal one of the cards in their hand, which is going to show you information you shouldn't know, but you need to know to help them. It just doesn't quite work, but it is a fun game and it has a lot of fun systems to explore. Next up, we have Kemet, which just barely loses to the winner. The winner is Rising Sun at 3.97 out of 5, whereas Kemet is a 3.85 out of 5. Very close. And ultimately, what makes the difference is that Rising Sun is more accessible to the various audiences, both in its theme of being feudal Japan and also in its mechanics where there's a lot of negotiation and player interaction where you could help a new player along, whereas in Kemet, it's a little bit less new player friendly. And so ultimately, Rising Sun goes up to the next level, but Kemet is a really good intermediate board game experience, and Rising Sun is a good lower level intermediate to upper level beginner board game level that you could play with beginners sometimes depending on the beginner. Now that I'm done with round 1, please go down into comments. Let us know what you're thinking. And by us, I mean not just me so I can respond, but all the people who are going to watch this video so that they know what the internet thinks of what I've said. In general, people who have played these games and really appreciated them will be able to defend them better than I've put them forward, and also maybe be able to agree with my opinions to show that it's not just me thinking this way. So let me know in the comments so I can respond and we can have a good conversation there. Now, round 2, we're going to have Small World versus Oath. Small World is ultimately the winner because Oath is not super accessible. It's hard to take out. In fact, even though me and my wife really like this game, we don't get it out as much as we wish we could because the rules are so complicated. There are so many specific rules that just you have to check the rule book all the time for. And they're not bad rules, they just are too specific, and it makes it a silver recliner. Whereas Small World is straightforward, easy to explain, you can take it out all the time, and therefore it goes up to level 3. Now, on the other end of things, we have Star Wars Rebellion versus Rising Sun, and this is a silver versus a silver, so we have to go to points. Rising Sun has a 3.97 out of 5, like I said before, and Star Wars Rebellion has a 3.84 out of 5. So, ultimately, Star Wars Rebellion loses to Rising Sun by a smidgen, and it ultimately comes down to the fact that Rising Sun can be played with 3 to 5 players, whereas Star Wars Rebellion can be played with 2 players. Technically, you can play with 4, but from my understanding, the 4-player game is so ultimately speaking, I would say that Rising Sun, because it's going to be on the table more for more player counts, is going to get higher. But if you have that one person you really want to duel, Star Wars Rebellion is probably better for a 2-player game than many of the games up here, and is definitely better than Rising Sun, which doesn't even have a 2-player version. Now, if you're really appreciating this, if this is helping you understand which game you and your group should buy, please let us know by hitting that subscribe button, that notification button, and that like button. That helps us out immensely and gets this video out to more people to help more people know which games they should and shouldn't buy for them. Our final round is Small World versus Rising Sun, and Small World has a gold recliner, Rising Sun has a silver recliner. We all know which one wins this match, but ultimately, why? Well, with Small World, I'm going to reference you to this video where I give a full review of Small World so that you can get a full idea of why Small World is the top of this list. But for Rising Sun, I'm going to say it's ultimately going to come down to Small World is more playable for new players. Rising Sun, even though an upper level beginner, it would have to be really pretty high upper level beginner to want to play this game, and then lower intermediate, which means that it just has a slightly smaller audience. On top of that, it has a few areas where it could have polished things up a little bit better to end up being higher, whereas Small World has very few problems with it and is more accessible to the wider world. All right, so that brings us to the 5 board games on Amazon that I would say you should buy in these 2 categories. First off, we have Oath. If you want a legacy game, Oath is the one for you. If you want a game where you're feeling like you're role-playing as characters in a really interesting world, then Oath is the one for you. And finally, Oath is a goal-based game. You are aiming for goals, not victory points, which makes Oath a fascinating experience and a fascinating game. Next up, we have Star Wars Rebellion. Now, Star Wars Rebellion, like I said, is amazing if you have one other person that you like to go up head-to-head against. You're going to role-play and you're going to play Star Wars. It's an amazing pitch, and for most nerds out there like me, you've got that one other person right in your head going, ooh, that's gonna be fun with that person. So make sure you pick that up if that's what you've got in your head. Next up, we've got Kemet and Rising Sun. I'm gonna talk about them together because they're actually kind of polar opposites. Kemet, everybody starts with the same start point, and they slowly build up technologies to make themselves different. So every game is gonna be different because you're gonna be getting different techs, but you're always going to start at basically the exact same spot. Rising Sun is the opposite of this, where everybody starts with an asymmetric faction, and they don't really change that faction much throughout the game. Kemet is a game all about combat. You're basically always fighting everybody on the board, whereas Rising Sun has a lot of diplomacy, those yin-yang figures you have to use. And so the 2 games have 2 totally different feels, and it all comes down to which one will work better for your group. Rising Sun only won because it's more accessible than Kemet, which is an intermediate game, and if you're not an intermediate gamer, you probably shouldn't play Kemet. Rising Sun is something where somebody maybe could play it as a beginner. All right, and then finally, we have Small World. I've talked ad nauseum. Like I said, there's that video over in the description. But let me summarize my thoughts here. First off, this is a game for all levels. Second off, it's an always new experience because you never know which factions are going to come out with which special powers. And then finally, it's a straightforward area control game. It's going to scratch that itch that most people have to put things onto a map, invade, attack, and build an empire, while doing it in a new way that's exciting for everyone, including the experienced gamers at the table. And if you really appreciated this, please head over to our Patreon, show your support monetarily so that we can continue doing this week after week for you guys. And as always, thank you so much for joining us today on Rest and Reason.